Hello learners, welcome to this session on assessment in counseling. So learner, this session is basically divided into two parts, and this session is basically divided on the content. What we are going to discuss is related with the how a counselor use assessment in the counseling setting. So assessment in counseling has been divided into two parts. The first part is basically divided certain contents in which we are going to talk about what assessment in counseling is all about. Then we will take a very brief history about assessment practices that are going on in counseling from initial times. And we will also look upon the concept related with the assessment and testing and how they are different from each other, and therefore we will take a certain things which is related with the counselor and how and when the counselor can use the testing procedures and what are the things they should keep in mind when we go for the assessment process, and when they use the test, standardized test, what are the code of conduct which has been decided by American Counseling Association, we will discuss in these sessions. So learner, you know that the counseling is a helping profession. When we talk about the helping profession, it does not help only to the client, but it also helps to the individuals, families, groups to achieve the wellness through the different settings. And when we go for the helping behavior, when we display helping behavior, the things that comes in the picture is the counselee and counselor. So counselee is one who come up with the certain problems, certain issues, and the client who is going to share certain problems with the counselor, and the counselor is someone who is trying to give a proper guidance or direction to the client so that they can achieve their wellness in their life, and it will also help us for their growth. When we talk about the counselor, there is a very common thing that all counselor try to do in their counseling setting. One is to weakening the weakness of the client and strengthening the strength of the client. So for effective counselor has to know the strength and weaknesses of their client, and the client is inquire with his or her own issues with abilities, interest, values and life experiences. So the client come up with the unique, and we know that every individual has unique abilities, and also at the same time every individual experience a different unique kind of issues in their life. So for that the counselor should know each and everything that comes with the counselee, especially when they discuss issue with the counselor. So the counseling approach has a vary from case to case. Because of this uniqueness, the counselor approach can be differ person to person. So the better you know the client, the better counselor you are. So therefore necessary to collect as much as information about the client as possible, because this information is going to help counselor to deal with the issue which are facing by the client, him or herself. Hence here the picture that comes, that the part of assessment and testing comes into picture, because without having assessment and testing procedures we can't gather information that we required to deal with the issues which are facing by the client. So it helps us, the counselor, is to knowing the client in a systematic and a very objective way for identifying the client's problem, planning intervention and evaluating its impact. So this is something through assessment the counselor can identify the client's problem, they can plan, they can make an intervention accordingly, and also when they execute the intervention, there is a chances that can also be evaluated further whether this intervention has any impact or not. So here we would like to discuss about the things which is related with the assessment. So what assessment is all about? We know that assessment is a process of gathering the needed information by the counselor for having a holistic knowledge of the client and his or her problems. So the purpose of assessment is to gather information as much as possible. We are very much familiar with the assessment, because when we go for the examination we say this assessment procedures is happening through which the examiner assess the examinee how much they have learned certain material. So, similarly in the counseling setting, counselor also wants to know that which type of abilities the counselee have and also the different issues they are going through. So, as far as the assessment term is concerned, it can be defined as a process that integrates test informations with information from the other sources, like other sources means the information from other tests or maybe the individual, maybe the social education, employment, health or the psychological history, used to draw inference about the characteristics of the people, object and programs. So, the term can be easily understand here. The assessment is the process through which we gather information, and whatever the information which is required for the counseling setting, for the counseling process. So, as far as the definition is concerned, we have seen just before that it contains two parts basically. If we divide the whole definition, then we can see the first part is basically involved to collecting the data related with the clients from the various sources. Maybe the sources can be the client, which is direct sources, or some sources can be indirect, like the family members, maybe the friends, maybe the co-worker can also give a huge information about the client. So, in the very first part, assessment contains the gathering of information from direct or indirect method, whereas in the second part basically, or we can say in the first part, the direct and indirect method of collection of information can use the different techniques as well, like some standardized test can be used to gather information, some rating scale can be used. Apart from it, non-standardized technique can also be used to gather information like observation and interview. When we go over the second part of this definition of assessment, we see that the counselor use these data to formulate a comprehensive understanding about the client and also reason for the client seeking the counseling services as well as planning intervention. So, to planning intervention is a very important part, and it can only be possible when the counselor have a very good information about the client. Here the term testing comes into the picture. It is closely associated with the assessment, and we can say it is one of the tools of assessment. Although the assessment comprises a variety of things, as I just mentioned before, like direct method, indirect method, and assessment can be done with the help of various things. In one tools that we have or technique we have, which is called psychological testing, or we can say in this testing only. So, the psychological test is an objective standard measure of behavior. So, it is an objective standard measure of a behavior. It is not the subjective one, but when we say about the testing, it comes under the objective and standardized measure of a behavior. So, counselor use a variety of tests to know different abilities about the counselee, about aptitude, interest, personality traits and many more about the clients. So, tests are used so frequently in the counseling setup that they are often interpreted and assessment by many people, even by the professional as well. So, however, assessment includes much more than the testing. So, sometimes the people get confused, or sometimes they interchangeably use the word assessment and testing. So, assessment is a more broad things which comprises testing as well. So, observation and interview are also covered under the assessment, whereas the testing is a very standardized and objective measure when we talk about the psychological testing comes for the behavior. So, we have discussed about testing, which is one of the part of assessment. Let us talk about historical overview of assessment practice in counseling. Why we should go for the history? The reason is we have to look the actual origin from where the assessment began. Although assessment is a practice which has been integral component of the professional counseling since the very beginning of the 19th century, and from the day of, we can say that the Parson till today, means the Frank Parson, who is known as a father of guidance he contributed a lot for the especially for the guidance, and later on it formed a backbone of the counseling, or we can say it actually developed a basics for the counseling profession. So, the Frank Parson, who is known as the father of guidance, is basically written a book which is very popular, which is known as Choosing a Vocation. So, in his book, which was published in 1909, he considered 3 factors to be necessary for the wide choice of vocations. What are the 3 conditions? 1, the knowledge of the work; the second, knowledge of the self; and the third one, matching of those two based on the true reasoning. So, when we try to identify which vocation, which profession is effective for anyone, then there are 3 things that should be considered by any individual. Or if you are a counselor, if the person is a counselor, then they should also concentrate on these 3 things. 1, if they have to select if they are in the process of selecting the profession, they should know about the profession well, in a well manner, means the knowledge of the work should also be clearly known by the individual. Knowledge of self and how these two are matching with each other are also important. So, assessment here also discussed by the Frank Parson, and he actually discussed like it should be identified what person know about himself and how their profession are in line with their interest, and not only the interest but the capability, the ability they have. His idea is actually followed by development of method to access the abilities, aptitude, interest, ambition, resources and limitations of the students. So, Choosing a Vocation in 1909, actually a very good book. Frank Parson, who is actually published this book and who is also known as the father of guidance. In 1905, the Binet and Simon and Binet are the 2 persons who developed Binet-Simon scale, and it is basically one of the first scale you can say for measuring the level of intelligence. These events happen because of the requirement of French government, who asked Simon and Binet to develop a intelligence scale to identify the level of intelligence among the students who are going through a very even tough situation when they are going in the school, or if the performance is not that much effective, then there is a need to go for the assessment. Or also the French government was keen to know about who is suffering from mental retardation, and for that Binet and Simon worked together to develop an intelligence test which was very popular on that time, and we can say it is one of the first intelligence scale which was standardized in nature and used further to identify the intelligence. Then the First World War is also one of the important event that actually give a proper foundation for the counseling profession. Here the counseling profession came into picture, or you can say that the counseling profession has actually one of the things which can be considered, which is the First World War. During the First World War, there was a need to have a good army personnel, and for that for recruitment of army personnel, there are certain tools were required, and Army Alpha and Army Beta intelligence tests were developed to identify, to assess the army personnel who can be recruited, and later on it will also apply for the non-army person to know about themselves. So, later on we can see the development took place, and in development we can see the Wessler intelligence scale developed by David Wessler. In 1920 we have seen the Rorschach blot test, and later on MMPI, Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory was also developed. In all the domain of human behavior has been now started to observe with the help of standardized tools. So, this historical background gives us a proper picture that this is not the matter of today's understanding, but it actually coming from the last 1 century, you can say, and more than that, the psychologists were keen to know and to observe the behavior very effectively. Let us talk about how the assessment is different from test. As you can see in the slide, that there is a two column where which we go through, and in this slide you can identify how the assessment is different from test. Let us talk about one by one. Like assessment is a broader and holistic evaluation covering a wide spectrum of behavior, whereas in the test is an instrument that measures the simple or we can just say the sample of behavior at a specific point of time. Second differences you can identify easily, it using multiple methods of collecting information like observation, interview, rating scale, case history, etc. As well as in the testing, you can see that it is ordinarily restricted to administering one or more tests at a time. So, in assessment we use a variety of method, where in the test there is only one method and it is restricted for the administration. We can administer one test at a time. When we talk about assessment, it involves a collection of data from the multiple sources, both direct as well as indirect. So, in the direct method we have a client, and indirect method the person who is related with the client, like maybe parents, teacher and other friends, whereas the testing involves a collection of data only from the direct sources. There is no opportunity for the indirect sources. The client based on his or her performance can be observed at a time. So, testing is one of the tools of the assessment, you can say in other words. Like in assessment, use both formal as well as informal method of gathering information. In the assessment process we use standardized, where the standardized or we can say the formal method in which we comes with the test, as well as informal we use a different non-standardized method for gathering the data, like interview and the observation are non-standardized, whereas in the test it is as per the definition given by Anastasi, we can see that the tests are the standardized instruments only. So, as far as the assessment is concerned, the context of assessments are usually natural, whereas the context of the testing are not natural in nature, it is in artificial or very controlled context we formulate. Hence, they have the test or we can say with the real world performance, we can say it is different from the natural world, but it is somehow controlled conditions. When we talk about assessment, the data collection can be quantitative as well as qualitative, but in testing mostly we collect the data with the quantitative measure only. Now, this is a time when we should know that who can apply the test. As you know that the test is a very standardized process through which we collect the data, and in standardization of the test we think about various methods we apply that we will cover in the upcoming sessions. But here I would like to introduce you one which is very important, which is called ACA, American Counseling Association Code of Ethics, especially for the professional organization of a counselor in the United States had prescribed the code of ethics for the professional of counselor and counselor in training. So, the code of ethics actually formed who can use the test and who can go for the testing, and especially who can administer the test. The reason is that if the person is not competent enough, there is a huge chances that the test can be misinterpreted, or maybe the test cannot administered properly, and which can have a very negative impact. It can be some ethical issue, maybe some consequences can be some legal issue. So, for that reason American Counseling Association formed a code of ethics that every counselor or those who are going for the testing should follow the guideline and follow the code of ethics, which is moreover divided into 8 parts, but here we are going to focus majorly 7 things which are very prominent as far as the code of ethics is concerned. So, the first things which is a code which comes here, which is called general code. The primary purpose of assessment is to gather information regarding the client, and that can be used for the client decision making process, especially to take decision about the client, for the treatment planning, for the forensic proceeding, etc. So, the counselor must prevent themselves and other for misusing the test result. The client's right to know the purpose and the result of the assessment must be respected. So, here the general guideline is like this, like the data that the counselor is collecting, it cannot be used for other purposes. It can only be used for the counseling purposes, because on the basis of this data the counselor is going to make an intervention plan. So, another code of ethics is the competence to use and interpret the assessment instruments. Who is competent? This has been also discussed in the code of ethics, where the counselor must perform only testing and assessment service for which they are competent. They must have a thorough understanding of the psychometric before making a decision based on the assessment results, and assessment is instrument must be used in the prescribed manner. Whatever the prescribed manner is there, the guidance is there to assess or to use the tools and to administer the tools should be followed completely by the counselor and whoever is using this testing procedure. So, here the another code of conduct is to the person should have a proper competency, otherwise it can be misinterpreted, the result can be misinterpreted. So, another code of conduct is to inform consent in assessment. So, informed consent necessary. Informed consent means the prior to the assessment, the counselor must explain to the client about the nature of and the purpose of assessment and the specific use of the result, where they are going to use this result and what are the purpose to go for the testing. Because if the client is unaware about the test, there is a chances that they might not be feel comfortable to give a proper response to the. And another things that we need to know here as a code of ethics, which is called instrument selection. So, when we can't apply any test to anybody, because the instrument selection is very important point. So, instrument selection used assessment must be reliable and valid. If the instruments is not reliable and not valid, we can't use any instrument, because it may be somehow evaluated wrong things or wrong, the result would be not genuine in nature and may be exaggerated in nature, which can harm the client, and also the whole procedures that apply during the counseling can be damaged. So, here we need to know the things related with the condition of assessment and administration is also comes under the code of ethics, where the counselor must ensure that the assessment are administered under the standardized condition as mentioned in the manual, which usually comes with the psychometric test, and an unsurprised use of the assessment instrument must be discouraged. Multicultural issues and diversity in assessment is also taken into consideration, like demographic factors such as age, gender, socioeconomic status, caste, race, ethnicity may affect the assessment process. We know that it may affect the assessment process. So, because the gender has certain roles, socioeconomic status has certain role. So, to further culture and context, language and disability of the client also need to be considered by the counselor while administrating and interpreting the assessment. So, and the last code of conduct is to scoring and interpretation of the assessment. This is a scoring and interpretation is very important here. While reporting result, counselor must explain the limitations of the assessment in terms of the validity, reliability and inappropriateness of the norms. Due to the variation in the assessment conditions, it usually happens the client level of understanding and the possible impact of the result on the client must be considered. So, this is the service provider or those who are assessing the client, they must ensure, they must maintain the ethical responsibility, that what are the ethical responsibility is there for the client. So, at last I would like to summarize this session, and I would say that assessment is a very essential things that the counselor perform during the counseling. The reason only is to gather as much as possible information about the client, to know better the client, to become a better counseling sessions. So, to know the client is a very essential thing for the counselor. In order to know the client better, they go for the assessment process. In assessment, we use a standardized test, and we have seen how assessment is different from test. So with these sessions that you would able to understand what assessment is all about and what testing is all about, and how assessment is significantly play a role in the counseling sessions. Thank you.